Chapter 20 of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography, by Walter Geer. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. 20. 1814. The Campaign of France. When Napoleon had recrossed the Rhine at Mayence, and found himself once more on the soil of the Empire, he had a feeling of discouragement which it was difficult for him to conceal. He was no longer the conqueror returning in triumph to his people. The Russian disaster he had been able to dissemble and attribute to the forces of nature, but no such course was possible to the general who had been vanquished at Leipsic. He remained a few days at Mayence, and then left for Paris. On the evening of the 9th of November he reached St. Cloud, where he was welcomed by the Empress. He had not a word to say regarding the results of the campaign, and addressed no reproaches to Marie Louise on account of his desertion by her father. The 14th of November there arrived at St. Cloud an emissary of peace from the allied sovereigns. This was Baron de Saint Aignan, Napoleon's minister at Weimar. He was authorized to say to the Emperor that the Allies were willing to treat for peace on the basis of the natural frontiers of France, the Rhine, the Alps, and the Pyrenees. It is very difficult now to say whether these proposals were sincere or not. But Napoleon, even in defeat, still inspired so much respect and fear, that it is more than probable that he could not even then have made peace with honor. At this moment neither the Czar nor the Emperor Francis desired the return of the Bourbons. The Allies, with the memories of the Revolutionary Wars still fresh in their minds, hesitated to cross the Rhine and the Pyrenees. The ablest of their ministers advised a policy of conciliation as both honorable and prudent. Napoleon, instead of seizing this opportunity, returned an evasive answer, and suggested a congress at some future date, without indicating in any way his views as to the proposal. When he finally decided 2 weeks later to accept the conditions, it was too late. The Allies had been informed by the Royalists in France of the weakness of Napoleon's position, and the offer was withdrawn. When Napoleon finally decided that peace was necessary, he wished to recall Talleyrand to his former post of Minister of Foreign Affairs, but the latter refused, because the Emperor insisted that in becoming minister he should resign his position of Vice Grand Electeur. Over such an insignificant matter of etiquette Napoleon at this critical moment lost the services of his ablest adviser. The Emperor then appointed the wise and pacific Caulaincourt, who was persona grata to the Czar, at whose court he had held the position of French ambassador. But it was now too late for negotiations. As Bismarck once said, "There are moments in diplomatic affairs which never return." The 19th of December the Emperor in person opened the session of the Corps Legislatif with great pomp. He failed to receive the usual enthusiastic reception. 2 days later the Allies began the invasion of France. The nation which for over 20 years had not seen an invader on its soil was not prepared for its defense. The fortresses of the Elbe and the Vistula were strongly garrisoned and well supplied, but no thought had been given to the strong places of France. Nearly 150,000 veteran troops were holding the German fortresses, and as many more were still fighting in Spain, while in France there were not enough soldiers to guard the Rhine. On the 11th of December, 1813, Napoleon had concluded a treaty with Ferdinand, by which the latter was to be restored to the throne of Spain, and the French garrisons were to come home. Again it was too late. These soldiers who might have saved the Empire did not return in time to fight the invaders. On learning of the signature of this treaty, Joseph was profoundly mortified, but there was nothing to do but to submit. He retained his title of king and the dignity of the Prince of the Empire, and took up his residence in the Luxembourg. At the moment that the brothers became reconciled, Napoleon was to cut to the quick at learning that his sister Caroline and her husband Murat had deserted him and gone over to the Allies. Strangest thing of all, it was the other Caroline, the sister of Marie Antoinette, the deposed Queen of Naples, from whom the Emperor received the first warning of this defection, and it was this same Caroline who had so much reason to detest Napoleon, who a few months later reproached her granddaughter Marie Louise for abandoning her unfortunate husband. After the battle of Leipsic, the main army of the Allies advanced to the Rhine, where they remained stationary during the month of November. There were no active operations except in Holland, and around the fortresses along the Elbe and the Oder. The situation was so uncertain that the Allies did not feel justified in advancing on Paris. it was reported that Napoleon had raised a new army of 300,000 men, and after the surprise of the previous spring they were ready to believe anything. It was at this time that the sovereigns made the very favorable offers of peace which Napoleon was so insensate as not to accept. They did not then know that the French army was far short of its strength on paper, that it was not and could not be properly equipped, and that it was suffering severely from an epidemic of typhus. At the close of the year 1813, the main allied army of about 200,000 men, under Schwarzenberg, was on the Rhine between Bâle and Mannheim, and another army of 80,000 was at Mayence and Coblence under Blucher. Bernadotte had gone to Holstein. Bennigsen was confronting Davout at Hamburg, and Bülow was in Holland with one Prussian and one Russian corps, 70,000 men in all. This gave the Allies an army for active operations of about 350,000 in all. At the same time Napoleon's total available forces did not exceed 100,000 men, and they were scattered at a dozen different points from Bâle to Brussels. If there ever was a time when Napoleon needed to put to use his rule of concentration, it was now. If after Leipsic he had drawn in St. Cyr and Davout from Germany, Eugene from Italy, and Suchet and Soult from Spain, to add to his field army, there is no question that he could have kept the Allies beyond the Rhine, and retained his throne with the enlarged boundaries of France. But for the time being the general was sunk in the monarch, and he was governed by political rather than military considerations. The wide separation of the small French forces was in the highest degree unwise. He should have abandoned for the moment his conquests in Belgium, Italy, and Spain, concentrated all his forces on the Rhine, beaten the several allied armies in detail, and driven them from the soil of the Empire. He would then have recovered his prestige and his territory at one blow. But the Emperor did nothing of the kind, and it is difficult to recognize at this time the man whose first principle of war was to mass every man and every gun for battle. If there was not time to concentrate his forces along the frontier, he should certainly have done so for the defense of the capital. If he lost Paris, all was lost, for all history shows that Paris is the heart of France. Napoleon did not expect that the Allies would attempt to invade France before spring, and he thus hoped to have ample time for his preparations. In this he was disappointed. This time they did not intend to give the Emperor an opportunity to reorganize and recruit his army. The plan of operations adopted by the Allies was simplicity itself. Paris was their objective, and they purposed to march on the capital in 3 columns. The most direct route from Germany is through Metz to Châlons, and Napoleon expected them this way. But the main army under Schwarzenberg advanced from Bâle towards Dijon, while the second army under Blucher was to move on Metz the moment that the first had crossed the Jura mountains. As soon as the two armies were in touch with each other, they were to march on Paris by the valleys of the Seine and the Marne. If Napoleon assumed the offensive, they purposed to threaten his flanks while avoiding a decisive engagement. At the same time, the third army, under Bülow, was to advance from Holland through Namur on Laon, and approach Paris from the north. We do not propose to enter into the details of the invasion until Napoleon himself appears upon the scene the last of January. No serious defense was possible from the feeble cordon of French troops facing the Rhine, and the advance of the Allies to the Marne was only a promenade militaire. From the time of his return to Paris early in November, the Emperor had been busy trying to raise a new army. He might have withdrawn 300,000 trained soldiers from the fortresses of Germany and from his armies in Spain and Italy, but as we have seen he was deterred by political considerations, although the military situation demanded it. On paper he succeeded in raising a new levy of nearly 1,000,000 men, but Houssaye calculates that not more than 1/3 were actually called up, and not over 1/8 ever fought. From Suchet and Soult in Spain he withdrew about 25,000 men; from Italy, none, and the troops left in Germany were soon invested and ultimately forced to surrender. Into the details of Napoleon's efforts to raise a new army we cannot enter. When he finally faced the enemy at Châlons the last week in January, he had only 50,000 troops available for immediate operations. The theatre of the campaign of France is an irregular pentagon of which the 5 corners are Paris, Laon, Saint Dizier, Chaumont, and Fontainebleau. The country is generally flat and in parts scantily populated. The two principal rivers in this area are the Marne and the Seine, which flow more or less parallel to each other until they begin to converge to unite just outside Paris to the east. They are rarely fordable in winter and are always serious military obstacles. There are also many large tributaries to these rivers, which were of importance in the campaign. Across the theatre of war there were three great roads to Paris: 1. From Châlons via Château-Thierry; 2. From Chaumont via Troyes; and 3. From Auxerre via Sens, joining the second route at the crossing of the Marne outside Paris. These roads passed many times over the Marne and Seine and other streams, and the destruction of the bridges had an important effect on the course of operations. On the 26th of January, Napoleon took command at Châlons of the forces of Ney, Victor, Marmont, and a little later of Mortier as well, in all about 50,000 men. From there he advanced up the Marne to St. Dizier, where he learned that Blucher had marched to Brienne. Napoleon followed and attacked Blucher, who narrowly escaped capture in the Château of Brienne. The army of Silesia fell back to Bar-sur-Aube to get in touch with Schwarzenberg. After waiting 2 days at Brienne, the Emperor prepared to march to Troyes. At La Routière, on the 1st of February, he was attacked by the first and second allied armies, which outnumbered him 4-1. But the attack was begun late in the day, and Napoleon was able to hold his own until darkness fell. The following day he retreated to Troyes, hotly pursued by the allies. After the battle it was decided that the two allied armies should again separate; that Blucher should march to Châlons and thence by the valley of the Marne to Paris; that the army of Bohemia should advance on Troyes, and thence by both banks of the Seine on Paris; and that the Cossacks should form a connecting link between the two armies. Meanwhile Napoleon, with his usual intuition, had already divined the probable movements of the enemy. He immediately moved across to Nogent. There he left Victor and Oudinot with half his force to hold back Schwarzenberg, while he crossed the Seine with the Guard, 30,000 strong, and marched north. On the 10th, at Champaubert, he struck the centre of the Silesian army, which was strung out on a line about 45 miles long, and destroyed one corps. Then, leaving Marmont to check Blucher's advance, he turned to the west and attacked one of York's corps, and forced it to retreat to Château-Thierry. Leaving Mortier to contain York, he dashed off again with his main body to Montmirail, at the same time sending Marmont orders to fall back on that place, and draw Blucher after him. The Prussian general fell into the trap, and was defeated by Napoleon and forced to retire to Châlons, a distance of 40 miles. These brilliant victories in 3 successive days recalled the glories of the campaign of Italy. The whole Silesian army had been put hors de combat, and forced to abandon its advance on Paris. For the time being, Napoleon had knocked out his most dangerous and implacable enemy. In a letter to his wife, Blucher said, "I have had a bitter 3 days." But with his usual hopefulness and pluck, he adds, "Don't be afraid that we shall be beaten. Unless some unheard of mistake occurs, that is not possible." After defeating Blucher, it was high time for Napoleon to return to the assistance of his retaining force on the Seine. Leaving Mortier and Marmont to look after the army of Silesia, he hurried back to the valley of the Seine, where Victor and Oudinot had been forced back to within 12 miles of Paris. While Napoleon was dealing with Blucher, Schwarzenberg had seized Troyes and continued his advance on a wide front between the Seine and the Yonne. He stormed Sens, and his vanguard reached Fontainebleau. While the army of Bohemia was thus continuing its leisurely advance, Napoleon suddenly fell upon it, and during the 5 days, from 17 to the 21st of February, defeated it 3 times, and inflicted such heavy punishment on his adversaries that they retreated hastily to Bar-sur-Aube, over 100 miles from the capital. In the meantime, Blucher had again advanced and was driving Marmont and Mortier before him. On receiving this information, the Emperor decided to discontinue his pursuit of Schwarzenberg, and fall upon Blucher again. Leaving 30,000 men on the Aube, under MacDonald and Oudinot, to try to keep back the Bohemian army, he took the remaining 25,000 to join the 15,000 that were with his marshals on the Marne. He arrived there on the 2nd of March, having covered 75 miles in 5 days. He immediately fell upon Blucher's left, and drove him back on Soissons. This place had been held by a French garrison, which had capitulated only 24 hours before, unknown to Napoleon. The Silesian army was thus able to escape, and marching north to Laon, it effected a junction with Bernadotte, thus bringing Blucher's forces up to 100,000 men. On the 7th, Napoleon defeated an advance guard of the enemy at Craonne, and drove it back on Laon, where a battle took place on the 9th. Napoleon was repulsed, and was obliged to retire to Reims to rest his men. On the 14th, Schwarzenberg, who had learned of Napoleon's absence from his front, began another advance, but retreated again to Brienne on the news of the Emperor's approach. Thus, after 6 weeks' fighting, the Allies were no nearer Paris than at the beginning of the campaign. In order not to interrupt the narrative of the military operations, no reference has yet been made to the peace negotiations which were carried on for several weeks during the course of the campaign, and we must now turn for a moment to the duller affairs of the diplomatists. The Congress was held at the little city of Chatillon on the Seine, very near to the theatre of war. There were present the plenipotentiaries of England, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and France. The Emperor was represented by Caulaincourt, his Minister of Foreign Affairs. Nothing could have been more difficult than the role of the French commissioner. Caulaincourt was a brave general, a man of honor, a patriot if there ever was one. Absolutely devoted to the Emperor, he was nevertheless sincerely in favor of peace, which he believed to be the only salvation for Napoleon and for France. If his prudent advice had been followed, the Emperor might have saved his throne. Napoleon could have had peace if he had been willing to accept the frontiers of 1792, but he insisted on "the natural boundaries," which he at once rejected. At times the Emperor seemed ready to give way, but as soon as he gained a military success he was again obdurate. Caulaincourt filled with honor and dignity his thankless role. The Congress opened at Chatillon on the 4th of February, just after Napoleon's desperate defensive battle at La Rothière. At that time the Emperor gave Caulaincourt carte blanche to conduct the negotiations to a happy finish. 3 days later the Powers made known their ultimatum that France should withdraw within the limits of 1792, and should have no voice in the disposition of the ceded territory. An immediate reply was demanded, yes or no, without any pourparlers. Caulaincourt expressed his willingness to accept even these hard terms, but upon condition that there should be an immediate suspension of hostilities. This condition was rejected by the Allies, and the following day the conferences were suspended for a week. When the sessions were resumed on the 15th of February, Napoleon had just gained his brilliant victories over Blucher, and he wrote Caulaincourt from Nangis, withdrawing his carte blanche, and insisting on the basis proposed at Frankfort, that is to say, the natural frontiers. Napoleon thought the Allies would be much more discouraged than they were. At the session of the 17th of February they presented a series of preliminary articles even more drastic than their previous propositions. When Napoleon heard of these demands his rage knew no bounds. He wrote Caulaincourt that he would rather see the Bourbons back than accept such infamous terms. But the Allies would not yield a single point. The last day of February they notified Caulaincourt that unless a favorable reply was received by the 10th of March, the Congress would immediately be dissolved. With much difficulty the French commissioner obtained an extension of 5 days, and finally, on the 15th of March, he presented the counter proposition of Napoleon, in which the Emperor made some minor concessions, but still insisted on the line of the Alps and the Rhine. The Allies considered this proposition as an ultimatum which made peace impossible, and on the 18th of March the Congress finally adjourned. The Allies now suddenly decided to cut loose from their communications and march directly upon Paris. This change of plan was brought about by several circumstances. Under the leadership of Talleyrand, who had long secretly desired the fall of Napoleon, a plot had been formed at Paris to dethrone the Emperor and restore the Bourbons. The allied sovereigns were informed of this conspiracy, but they were not entirely convinced that Napoleon's situation was as weak as represented. While they were still hesitating, a letter to the Emperor from Savary was intercepted, in which the minister described the exhaustion of the treasury, the arsenals, and the magazines, and spoke of the grave discontent of the population. After reading this letter the Czar decided to issue orders for an immediate march on the capital. At the same moment that the Allies began their advance on Paris, Napoleon suddenly effected a manoeuvre that has been differently criticised. Blamed by many, approved by few, the result of which was to bring about his fall within a few days. This manoeuvre consisted in passing to the rear of the Allied armies in order to cut off their communications. Napoleon hoped that they would follow him and thus be drawn away from Paris. The Allies, however, divided their forces, leaving 2 Russian and Prussian corps to watch Napoleon, while the rest of the army marched directly on Paris, driving before them the corps of Marmont and Mortier. In this sudden and rapid movement the Emperor of Austria became separated from his allies, an apparently unimportant incident, which, however, deprived Napoleon of the protection of his father in law and of Prince Metternich, at a very critical moment for himself and his dynasty. Marmont and Mortier were driven back to Paris, where they took up a position at Montmartre for the defense of the city, which was not fortified at that time. The 29th of March there was fighting at the gates of Paris along an immense line. The Allied armies formed an effective force of at least 150,000 men. To these the French could not oppose more than 30,000 men, who moreover were disheartened by recent defeats. The 2 marshals did not agree and would not act in concert. The confusion was great and the capture of Paris inevitable. The Allied army had marched on Paris in the form of a large semicircle, leaving only the route to Orleans open. By this road the Regent, the Empress Marie Louise, with her son, King Joseph, and the Imperial Government retired and took up their residence at Blois, thus leaving the capital without government, and a prey to all the elements of intrigue that were within it. The result was the surrender of the city to the Allies on the last day of March, almost without firing a shot. When Napoleon found that his movement to the east to cut the Allied communications did not cause them to fall back as he had expected, he was for the moment undecided whether to pursue them or to leave his army and hasten himself to the defense of his capital. Not dreaming that Paris would capitulate almost without resistance, he decided on the latter course, and traveled post haste via Troyes to Fontainebleau. Pushing on from there to Paris, at a point 12 miles south of the capital, he learned of the capitulation. He then turned back to Fontainebleau, and began to assemble his troops, who had followed him by forced marches with the idea of recapturing Paris. As soon as the Emperor reached Fontainebleau he sent Caulaincourt to Paris to see the Czar Alexander, with a letter of credentials, in which he gave him full power to negotiate and conclude peace, and promised to ratify any arrangement he might make. The 1st of April, the day after the Emperor's arrival, the heads of the columns from Champagne began to come in from the direction of Sens, and also the advance guard of the troops from Paris. The marshals also began to appear, and soon there could be seen at the imperial headquarters, Moncey, the commander of the National Guard of Paris; Lefebvre, who at the age of 60 had served through the campaign; Ney, Oudinot, and Macdonald, who came from Troyes; and Mortier and Marmont, who arrived from Paris. The troops as they came in were placed in position behind the Essonne, about 10 miles from Paris. The day after his arrival Napoleon already had 30,000 men in line. The Emperor, whose feeling of lassitude had passed away, was already laying his plans to seize Paris by a coup de main. He only awaited the arrival of further reinforcements, and the return of Caulaincourt from Paris. The first conference between the Allies was held the 1st day of April at the residence of Talleyrand. The departure of Marie Louise for Blois with her son and the Imperial Government, and the absence of the Emperor of Austria, who was only able to arrive on the 15th, when all was over, had left the field free to the enemies of the Empire. The news which Caulaincourt brought from the capital the night of the 2nd was most discouraging. The Czar was lodged in the hotel of Talleyrand, the central figure of the Royalist plot, who had just been named as the head of the Provisional Government, with 4 colleagues. But the restoration of the Bourbons was not yet decided, and the throne might still be saved if the Emperor abdicated in favor of the King of Rome. Caulaincourt urged Napoleon to take this course. The following morning the Emperor assembled the Old Guard in the court of the Cheval Blanc, and addressed them. He was received with such enthusiasm that for the moment he returned again to his plan of marching on Paris. But if the soldiers and the officers were still eager for war, the case was far different with the marshals, who were now, almost without exception, determined to force the abdication. Ney took the lead in speaking decisively, and even disrespectfully, to the Emperor. At noon on the 4th, Napoleon called the marshals to his salon, and ordered his secretary, Fin, to read the act of abdication, which he then signed. A careful reading of this paper will show that it was merely a conditional offer to descend from the throne, subject to the rights of his son, and was not an absolute abdication. Caulaincourt, Ney, and Macdonald were directed to take the paper to Paris, and make a final supreme effort at least to save the dynasty. On their way to the city the three plenipotentiaries stopped at Essonne to see Marmont. This little village, situated about 5 miles from Corbeil, was the headquarters of this marshal and of the 6th Corps which had been under his command during the campaign. The village bears the same name as the river which enters the Seine at Corbeil, and which separated the troops of Marmont from those of the Allies. On meeting Marmont, the emissaries of the Emperor were struck by his air of embarrassment, which they could not understand. The mystery was to be explained only too soon. Marmont, who had fought by the side of Napoleon since the days of Toulon, who had been rewarded by him with titles and riches, who had covered himself with glory during the campaign of France, Marmont had betrayed the Empire. Following a conference held at his hotel in Paris on the evening of the 31st of March, a few hours after the capitulation of the city, at which he became convinced that nothing could prevent the fall of Napoleon, he had decided to range himself under the white flag of the Bourbons. On the morning of the 4th of April, he called a meeting at his headquarters of all his generals except Chastel, and explained his plans. Such was the state of affairs when the same afternoon Caulaincourt, Ney, and Macdonald stopped at Essonne and informed Marmont of their mission, and asked him to accompany them to Paris. Having obtained a sauf conduit from Prince de Schwarzenberg, Caulaincourt and the three marshals proceeded to Paris, where they arrived at 2 o'clock on the morning of the 5th, and went directly to the hotel of Talleyrand, where the Czar was living. The Czar saw them at once, and gave them a very cordial reception. After listening to their pleadings in favor of the King of Rome, he promised to give them an answer during the course of the day, after a conference with his allies. An event fatal to the hopes of the imperial dynasty now occurred. Marmont had planned the act of treason, and during his absence his generals carried it out. The Marshal had hardly left for Paris when an aide de camp of the Emperor arrived at his quarters with an order for him to go to Fontainebleau. The generals of the 6th Corps at once jumped to the conclusion that the plans of their commander had been exposed to the Emperor. Without awaiting the return of Marmont, they decided to carry out the convention arranged with Schwarzenberg, and lead their troops across the Essonne within the Austrian lines. When the unfortunate soldiers, in the middle of the night, received their orders to cross the Essonne and march towards Paris, they thought, naturally, that they were about to take part in a movement for the recovery of the capital. But their suspicions were soon aroused when they saw that the Allies did not oppose their march, and the word treason ran through the ranks. When the sun rose and the situation became clearer, the rear column under General Chastel, which was not yet surrounded by the enemy, turned back and recrossed the bridge. When an aide de camp brought the news to Marmont at his hotel in Paris, he went immediately to find Ney, who was on the point of returning with his colleagues to see the Czar and receive his answer. Marmont told them of the action of his generals, and added, "I would give my arm if the report was not true." "Say your head," cried Marshal Ney, "and even that would not be enough." When the plenipotentiaries arrived at the hotel of Talleyrand, where the news had already been received, they found that the last chance to save the imperial throne had disappeared, and that the restoration of the Bourbons was certain. For the rest of his life the wretched Marshal was pursued by a feeling of remorse. In vain the Bourbons loaded him with honors. At the last, in 1830, he was to prove their evil genius, as he had been that of Napoleon in 1814. Driven into exile by the fall of Charles X, he ended his career at Schönbrunn, where he gave lessons in strategy to another exile not less unfortunate than himself, a young man who had been called the King of Rome, and who was then only known as the Duke of Reichstadt. In the meantime, Napoleon, at Fontainebleau, awaited impatiently the reply from Paris. In case of an unfavorable response, he was determined to march immediately on the capital, fall upon the allies, whose troops were scattered in and around the city, defeat them in detail, and reconquer his throne. Who can say that he would not have succeeded? At this moment came the news of the treason of Marmont, which ruined all his plans. Napoleon only pronounced these words: "L'ingrat, il sera plus malheureux que moi." When Caulaincourt, Ney, and Macdonald returned to Fontainebleau on the evening of the 5th, and reported the failure of their mission, they found the Emperor calm and dignified, with no reproaches for any one. After a night of reflection, Napoleon finally decided to submit to the inevitable. In the morning he summoned the marshals to his cabinet, and there, on a little round mahogany table, he signed his second act of abdication. The allied powers having declared that the Emperor was the only obstacle to the re establishment of peace in Europe, the Emperor, faithful to his oath, declares that he renounces for himself and his heirs the thrones of France and Italy, and that there is no sacrifice, even that of his life, which he is not ready to make in the interests of France. From the 6th to the 20th of April, Napoleon remained at Fontainebleau in a state of great depression. On the 12th, Caulaincourt brought for his signature the treaty which had been concluded at Paris the night before. This treaty gave to Napoleon the title of Emperor, with the sovereignty of the island of Elba, and an allowance of 2,000,000 francs a year. It also contained pecuniary provisions for his mother, Josephine, Joseph, Louis, Hortense, Elisa, and Pauline. He was also accorded the privilege of taking with him a body guard of 400 men. This treaty, which the allies considered the height of generosity, appeared to Napoleon to be an act of the most profound humiliation. He said that he would rather die than affix his name to so ignominious a convention. That night he took a dose of poison which he had carried in a sachet attached to a cord round his neck during the retreat from Moscow. But the poison had lost its strength and only caused him intense pain without ending his life. His physician Ivan gave him an antidote which soon relieved him. "Tout, jusqu'à la mort, m'a trahi," he said. "Je suis condamné à vivre encore." When he awoke the following morning he enjoined upon his suite absolute secrecy regarding this attempt of which he was now ashamed. He had entirely recovered his usual calm self possession, and during the course of the day he signed the treaty. In the career of Napoleon, history and legend are confounded. To us, the great Emperor appears like a hero of antiquity, and the veterans of his old guard are almost mythical personages like the legionaries of Caesar. The Adieu de Fontainebleau, the celebrated scene of the Emperor with the grenadiers of the Vieille Garde in the court of the Cheval Blanc, seems like the final act of a great historical drama. It is the 20th of April, the day of his departure. In the court the old guard is drawn up in serried ranks. The traveling carriages are already waiting. On the stroke of midday, the faithful Bertrand announces to the Emperor that all is ready. He traverses the gallery of Francis I, and descends the stairway of the Fer à Cheval with a firm and rapid step. The drums beat the charge. At the foot of the stairs, the Emperor makes a sign that he wishes to speak, and the drums are silent. "Soldiers of my old guard," he said, "I bid you farewell. For 20 years I have always found you in the path of honor and glory." After a few more words his voice broke. Then he continued, "Adieu, my children. I would like to press you all against my heart. Let me at least embrace your flag." At these words General Petit seized the flag and came forward. Napoleon received him in his arms, and kissed the eagle of the standard. Then, overcome with emotion, he entered the carriage which was to bear him away to exile. On the 27th of April Napoleon arrived at Fréjus, and the following day he embarked. The vessel dropped anchor in the harbor of Porto Ferraio the 3rd of May, and the next afternoon he landed amidst the cheers of the inhabitants, who were proud of their new sovereign. Elba lies in the Mediterranean, between Corsica and Italy, at a distance of only 7 miles from the mainland. The island has many times belonged to France, but today it is Italian. In all respects it is essentially Corsican. The island is about 17 by 12 miles in size, the greater dimension being from east to west. The customs of the islanders are most primitive. The climate is hot and unhealthy, skin diseases are common, and typhus is a scourge. Such was the prison to which the Emperor had been consigned. Napoleon, with his usual activity, at once visited every part of the island, on horseback or on foot, often walking for 10 hours under heat that would have felled an ox. He at once began many municipal improvements. He repaired the roads, dredged the ports, and developed the mines. He introduced the olive, the lemon, and the orange, which still flourish on the island. He also created an abundant water supply, and improved the health of the people by draining swamps and exterminating the mosquitoes. He gave the islanders their first lessons in cleanliness and sanitation. After lodging for a short time in a few rooms of the Hotel de Ville, the Emperor arranged for his home a building on the slope of the hill near the capital, acting as his own architect. This building the Albans called the Molini Palace. As no furniture could be obtained on the island, Napoleon sent an expedition to the mainland to secure the furniture of the palace of Piombino, belonging to his sister Eliza. 3 weeks after Napoleon reached Elba, the guard, who had left Fontainebleau several days before him, finally arrived. They were under the command of Cambronne, and numbered nearer 700 than the 400 men allowed by the Allies. At the time of his arrival at Elba, the Emperor had about 4,000,000 francs, nearly all of which he treated as a reserve fund only to be used in case of necessity, as he expected to live on the revenues of the island added to his allowance. The expenses of the administration of his little kingdom came to about 120,000 francs, and the revenues to nearly 3 times that sum, so that the budget was most satisfactory. There remained to be met, however, the Emperor's current expenses, and the maintenance of his little army, which alone cost nearly 100,000 francs a month. The Emperor's horses had come over with the guard to join their old master in exile. They were 7 in number, and had been ridden by him in many campaigns of the Empire, from Madrid to Moscow. There were also 48 horses to draw the various carriages, including the large sleeping coach in which Napoleon had made the journey to the coast. During the year Napoleon received 2 visits from his family. His sister Pauline came the last of May, but at that time only stayed 2 days. The 1st of August his mother arrived. A month later he received a visit from Madame Valeska, who came to share his exile. But Napoleon only allowed her to remain for 2 days, as he was still hoping that Marie Louise and his son would join him, and he wished to avoid any scandal. The Empress, however, had already consoled herself with Neipperg, and had no idea of rejoining her husband. Other cares now began to trouble the Emperor. The French government had failed to pay his income, and he had been forced to draw heavily on his reserve funds. His letters had no effect. France was as silent on this point as was Austria regarding Marie Louise. The Congress of Vienna was also debating whether it would not be safer to remove the Emperor to a point more distant from France. The outlook was far from reassuring. The 1st of November, Pauline returned and cheered Napoleon with her bright smiles. The life of the household was thoroughly domestic. The evenings were devoted to games of cards and chess. The Emperor usually retired at 9 o'clock, and rose an hour before déjeuner. He passed most of his days in excursions over the island, supervising the work which was going on. He occupied himself with the affairs of his little kingdom with the same attention that he formerly gave to his immense empire. On the whole, his life was not so unhappy. After so many emotions, he needed a little rest. In this quiet routine passed the final months of 1814 and the first 8 weeks of the following year. Then came the return from Elba, one of the most dramatic events in the history of the world. End of Chapter 20.